Heather, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, I can. It's kind of echoey, but I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it was echoey because I had it on another device because I couldn't get my volume to work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Otherwise, it sounds great.
Okay, good. I turned off the other one then. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Tyra.
How do you say your last name?
It's Fainstad, Fainstad.
Okay. I like I have to do your introduction, so I just wanted to make sure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course, and it's Tyra, like Tyra Banks.
Okay, perfect.
I think I'm good to go. Let me just practice sharing my screen. Yeah. All good.
Yes, everything looks great.
Thank you for getting up so early since it is very early in Colorado right now.
It is. It's at least better than when I used to live in Seattle. I just moved out there and I was like, man, that would be not quite 5.
How was
Does
your
that
time in
sound-
Santa Fe?
Oh, it was so good. Thanks for asking. I had never
I
been.
Yeah, I had just seen that when I sent you an email and I got your automatic reply.
Yeah. It was so good. Okay, I'm gonna go do emails and things, but I'll be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Okay. I know everyone's got a busy day ahead, so we'll get started. So good morning. Our speaker today is Dr. Tyra Fainstad, MD. In addition, our program is underwritten by an educational grant through OSU Medical Center Graduate Medical Education. A disclosure statement has been signed and is on file in the Graduate Medical Education Office. So Tyra Fainstad is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Colorado, where she is a primary care doctor and resident clinic director for internal medicine trainees at Lowry Internal Medicine. She has a scholarship interest in learner-centered feedback, assessment bias, and psychologically safe educational environments. She is a certified professional life coach and has co-created and co-directs an online group coaching program for physicians and trainees across the nation called Better Together Physician Coaching. She is also a practicing life coach for faculty in academia, specializing in imposter syndrome, confidence, time management, and relationships. She is a recovering approval addict on a never-ending path to self-awareness. Her purpose now is to create space for change through helping learners access inner validation rather than relying on external praise. Please welcome Dr. Tyra Fainstad.
Thank you so much. How fun it is to hear that read back to me. That is exactly who I am. Thanks, Mary Kate. Hi, everyone. I'm Tyra Fainstad, and I am so excited to be here. As Mary Kate said, I am a certified life coach, which is really something that I never thought I would be, but here we are. And in my coaching program for trainees and for faculty, something that I talk about all the time is imposter syndrome. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit with you today. And I just want to say I'm on a little bitty computer screen, so I can sort of keep track of the chat, but I can't keep track of the chat and your hand raises. So if you feel like you have something to say, please just unmute yourself and yell it out if you have questions that I'm not seeing in the chat or something like that. Definitely do that. All right, everyone, let's get started. I'm going to frame this talk today by first spending some time on the definition. It's a little nuanced, and so I want to get really clear on what I mean. I hear people use it incorrectly all the time. And then we're going to spend even more time on the cause, because that arguably is even more nuanced, and it's an area for people to kind of go into shame and shut down if we don't get it right. Finally, I'm going to talk about 3 hands-on tools that you can implement today to start mitigating the effects of imposter syndrome, not imposter syndrome itself necessarily. The first one is the biggest one. It's a sort of coaching 101 tool that I use. And then the last 2 are pretty quick. Okay. So I want you all to just take 2 minutes right now and jot down a few thoughts about the last time you felt like you didn't belong somewhere. If you're very brave, put a 1-liner or a 2-liner about it in the chat. If not, just write it on your phone. If you have a piece of paper nearby, if you're driving, just think about it. When's the last time you felt like you didn't belong? And I want you to keep that. We're going to call this a thought download, this little free write that you're doing. And I want you to keep it nearby because we're going to come back to it. Let's see, when was mine? The last time I felt like I didn't belong. You know what? It's wild. I am co-directing this physician coaching program, and being in academia and serving those that are in academia, we are pretty rigorously scholarly oriented. And so we've studied this program a lot. We've done now 4 randomized controlled trials proving its efficacy. And so I've grown this research team. And it started off as just a little, like whoever's interested can join the research team. And it was a kind of conglomerate of medical students and residents, and I had a fellow and then a couple faculty, but it has grown as we've done more and more research. And so have I, as someone who did not at all identify as a researcher. That was me. And I am now the PI on multiple grants about life coaching. Anyways, the last time I felt like I didn't belong was last week. I was leading this research team, and I've changed the format since the team is now like 40 people. And so we switched from an informal Zoom meeting to more of a formal works in progress meeting, and I facilitate it. And as I was introducing this format, I was just sitting here in this room, like staunchly steeped in I'm a fraud thoughts, because I still, I guess, have this voice that tells me, you know, there's no room for this soft science in research. And who do you think you are? People are going to find out that you're researching coaching. Of course, they're going to find it out. I write lots of manuscripts on it. But I just had these thoughts like, I don't deserve to be having this formal of a team. So that's the last time I felt like it. Anyone else who wants to be vulnerable and share, please do in the chat. I will come back to it, I promise. Okay. So there was my own imposter syndrome. Oh, I didn't even know it was there till I'm here coaching myself in front of you guys. The way that I define imposter syndrome is feelings of inadequacy that are there despite evidence to the contrary. Okay, so this is really important, and it's that last part that differentiates it from all other forms of uncertainty, many of which are healthy, many of which we want to have, and we certainly want our learners to have, right? I get asked all the time, isn't it true that, you know, our learners should be feeling doubt, should be even sometimes feeling like a fraud when they're in medical education situations that they have never been in before? And the answer is always yes, absolutely. Healthy uncertainty is just that, it's healthy. Imposter syndrome is different because of that last part. So despite evidence to the contrary, it would be like a very extreme example would be like if for some reason I was asked to give like a, you know, plenary speech at like the big chest meeting on, I don't know, pulmonary hypertension or something that I am not all that comfortable with as a primary care doctor. But for whatever reason, they wanted to like reach into the GIM crew and pluck out somebody to give their plenary, and they chose me. I would have heavy, healthy uncertainty, and it would drive me to do things like really research the topic and get experts' opinions and feedback and go over my slides a ton and practice. And it would be founded because I've never given a talk on pulmonary hypertension. Now, if I had those exact same thoughts before I did like a Medicare annual wellness visit, which is something I do all the time and have plenty of evidence that I can be successful at, then you can imagine it would really hold me back, right? So asking for feedback all the time, pulling my colleagues into the room, getting on up to date for every little complaint, even though I have tons of experience and don't necessarily need to do those things, would slow me down, not only efficiency wise and time wise, but it probably would make me sort of perseverate and get even more in my head about needing to do that. Okay. Imposter syndrome should definitely be named self-underappreciation syndrome. This is a misnomer in the medical community. We generally use syndrome to denote things that are actually true. So like people with IBS have an irritable bowel, right? People with imposter syndrome are not imposters. They actually just believe they are imposters when they are not. So I think we should recoin it to self-underappreciation syndrome, but it doesn't quite roll off the tongue. Again, it is not healthy uncertainty, right? Healthy uncertainty is helpful. Imposter syndrome holds us back. That's how you know. I'm going to teach you how to figure that out in a efficient way. Here are the signs of imposter syndrome. This is specifically true in medicine and in trainees, especially. This is the one that I hear the most. This is a huge red flag for me. I call it praise deflection. We will get into why, but it happens after they've maybe gotten a compliment or a nice evaluation, or someone has just praised them in any way, and they write it off as, oh, that person's just being nice. You know, has nothing to do with me. They're being nice. That's a red flag. Imposter syndrome is really prevalent and it's growing. So most physicians admit to feeling imposter syndrome at some point during their career. 2/3 of trainees actually admit to sort of like living in imposter syndrome or feeling frequent feelings throughout their training. It's way more common in women, and it is way more common in those that are not represented in medicine or in those that are not represented in any field that they are in. Which leads me to this slide. If you haven't read this article, it's now 2.5 almost years old. And it was published in the Harvard Business Review. It's really short. It's like 3 pages, and it is such a easy, elegant read. I highly recommend it. These 2 authors are now sort of taking off, rightfully so, and have done multiple podcasts. I believe they're writing a book. And I love it because it's highlighting this issue that is at the core of this talk, and it gives me space to frame my feelings about this. Essentially what they say is, hey, this is something that is happening really commonly in those that are underrepresented in any sphere that they're in. So isn't it sort of victim blaming to call it a syndrome and give it to that person rather than call it a cultural problem and hand it back to the culture? And the truth is actually, yes, it totally should be handed back to the culture, right? It is absolutely the fault of society, the fault of institutions, the fault of organizations, the fault of our culture that these people feel like they don't belong when clearly there's tons of evidence to the contrary. However, when we start talking about fault, something happens, right? Blame enters the picture and people get defensive instead of accountability entering the picture and people addressing it. This is a really big problem. And this is, of course, not just limited to imposter syndrome, but I'm going to frame it looking like this, and I'm going to use imposter syndrome. You could picture this iceberg being any well-being problem that we're having right now in the medical community. And there are many, especially after the pandemic, right? There's burnout and moral injury and depression and anxiety and attrition. People are leaving, people are suicidal. The one I'm talking about is imposter syndrome. And the way that the institution or the system tends to look at this problem is with this critical eye, looking at its people, its employees, its trainees, its people, saying, they don't seem like they're doing well. Gosh, that's so interesting. I wonder what changed. You know, back in my day, we didn't seem to have this resiliency problem. Nobody was talking about burnout. I wonder if they need more free food, right? Maybe they need a coffee cart to come around and give them coffee of appreciation. Oh, perhaps even they need a resiliency workshop, right? And on the other side, of course, you have the individuals, the employees, the trainees, the physicians, whoever it may be, looking at the problem and the institution's response to it saying, you effing kidding me? Like, that is condescending at best and completely malaligned at worst. Like, how about a new electronic medical record? Have you heard of the work compression that has happened? How about some help with that, some actual resources? By the way, the medical system is broken. Nobody's listening to me, right? Of course, what both of these are missing is what I think the bulk of the iceberg is. It's the medical culture that is made up of the individuals and the system. It's this milieu that we are all working and practicing and training and growing in. And it is a toxic culture for many, many reasons that I go over in a totally different talk. Our culture has been founded to idolize things like perfectionism, a bit of martyrdom, definitely overworking. Nobody honors their own boundaries, right? Patients first has almost turned into this like pathologic form of altruism that doesn't benefit anybody, right? Our culture is extremely toxic. And until we can get at the heart of that, I don't think any of this tip of the iceberg stuff is going to make a difference. And it's probably even hurting the culture because blame and shame enter the picture. So what I want to say, I just, again, want to focus this talk around the fact that culture change needs to happen. And it needs to happen at the system level, but it does also need to happen at the individual level. And I say that without blaming any individuals. But what I know is that if you have already trained in this culture that taught you about pathologic altruism, that taught you to ignore your own boundaries, even if that culture changes, even if the institution changes, even if we get a better EMR, if we get less, RVU targets, if we get more help, even if it changes in the right way, our brains are still so messed up and hardwired to be that way that we won't feel that benefit unless we also work on ourselves, right? I just read this paper in the New England Journal. I think it came out of the Sri Jansen lab that likened this argument to when we found out that asbestos caused lung cancer. And it was like, yeah, you can go around and strip all the buildings of asbestos. That certainly is the cause of a lot of people's lung cancer. But if you don't also give those people who have the cancer chemotherapy, right, you're like a blind monster. That's sort of like what I'm talking about here. It's like, yes, of course, we need to fix deep cultural problems and would love to fix racism and sexism and all the other forms of oppression that exist. First of all, though, those aren't changing in our lifetimes, I don't think, right? We're moving forward slowly, but not fast enough. And even if we did, there would still be damage already done, and we can't ignore those people. So that's what I'm here to talk about. Please let me know if you have questions around that argument, because I just think that it's so important to get on the same page about. Okay, so the actual cause of self-underappreciation syndrome or imposter syndrome is an overactive inner critic. This is a picture of my inner critic. You can see she's really mean, right? The inner critic is actually just a bundle of neurons that lives in your lower brain. It lives in your amygdala, and it has a job. It's there for a reason. And its job is basically to feed you information about how you might be socially perceived. Right? So there's a spot in our brain that is trying to save us. And it does this by just like kind of low-key pervasive criticism. Right? If we were to turn up the volume on this inner critic, it would just be like the most mean person inside your head constantly nagging you and telling you to be different. Lots of jokes there to be had. I'll keep it clean for this talk. Now listen, the inner critic gets its data from society. It gets its like manual about how you should be from your past and from society. So things that really influence the inner critic might be like critical moments for whatever reason, or they may be even random moments in your past. It might be like your kindergarten teacher's offhanded comment about like you're bad at reading or something. Boom, locked it in at the wrong moment of growth of your brain. And all of a sudden your inner critic has latched onto that. Or it also gets its data from just like repetitive messages, either implicit or explicit, of course, that it gets from society. So lots of thoughts there about how our bodies should look, how we should behave, what's the right way for this type of person to show up in a culture. That's the place that the inner critic gets these experiences. Medical trainees are getting lots of messages about how they should show up implicitly and explicitly from us, who then sort of transmit these messages about, is it really okay to take care of yourself? Is it really okay to go home and put this off until tomorrow? What could be done today? Is it really okay to say no to a patient ever? Right? Those types of messages. The inner critic, you can tell that it's your inner critic because this inner critic is lingering on the negative. It's very micromanagey, and it's hard to do things when the inner critic is yelling. When you are actively listening to your inner critic, it's like another loud thing to attend to in addition to the task at hand. The inner critic is especially turned on when there's a threat. And because it's in that lower brain, the inner critic goes into fight, flight, or freeze super quickly. Right? So it's happening in this fast loop. For those of you that have read Thinking Fast or Slow, this is system one. It's getting its information from the outside and acting subconsciously That means that a lot of the time you aren't even realizing that information is being handled by the inner critic because it doesn't hit your lovely prefrontal cortex where you can think about your thinking, unless you bring those thoughts up on purpose. I'm going to teach you how to do that in tool 1, right? Okay, if our inner critic gets very overbearing or loud, or if we decide to believe our inner critic and only our inner critic, these are the outcomes. This has been well studied over and over again using validated matrices. It's highly associated with burnout, anxiety, stress, even suicidal thoughts. This is a big deal, and it's a problem that's getting worse. I also want to take a moment again to normalize it, right? This is our brain trying to help us. This is an evolutionary trick gone wrong that our brains are implying over and over again. So our brains really want to keep us safe. Probably back in the cave people days, this was a very useful thing to know if we were acting strange and at some risk of being kicked out of the tribe. But now here we are, of course, millennia later, and it is no longer a risk of us dying from being kicked out of our tribe, but our brains haven't caught up as fast as our human technology has. So we're still left with this very loud inner critic that's just trying to save us. Then a select few of us go to medical school where the stakes are super high, literally is life or death. It's very competitive, and there's not a lot of psychological safety, right? There's not a lot of feeling safe if we show a deficit. In fact, probably that's when we feel the least socially safe, and our inner critic gets very loud, pretending to save us, really just holding us back. So it's heavily reinforced. Okay, what do we do about this? I hope I've convinced you about fact number 1. People with a loud inner critic are not broken, right? I have fantasized about a very specific stroke that we could have that is like just that part of the amygdala. I don't think it happens. I think there's like many blood supplies that go there, but wouldn't it be so interesting to meet someone without an inner critic? Probably they would be very strange. I think you actually do need some level of an inner critic, but certainly not the levels that physicians have. There is a study that exists. It's like done in the early 2000s around this area of negative self-talk in the brain and looking at people of different fields. And they found that actually the people with the most hypertrophied inner critics, the biggest negative self-talk nerve bundles in the amygdala, are physicians. The second biggest are teachers, which is very interesting for those of us that are medical educators. But we actually have physically bigger negative self-talk centers. And it sort of makes sense, right? Probably we use these a lot in order to keep ourselves in check. A lot of us have this idea that, we have to be feeling bad about ourselves in order to be good. We can never let ourselves off the hook. We have to kick our butts into being better. And that's how we function. That's this dark, rotting culture of medical training and medical practice that sort of amplifies that inner critic. So we're not getting rid of it. It's there. It's big for us. What do? We are going to take those thoughts from the subconscious lower brain and move them up to a place where you can look at them critically and use your prefrontal cortex to decide on purpose if you want to believe those thoughts, right? That's the work. This is something that was never actually explicitly taught to me in medical training. I learned this when I myself got a coach in a stage of deep early career burnout and really postpartum depression. But it is based on cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. So these are foundational, just really psychological, but also just cognitive science research that we know to be true. I know I learned CBT in med school, but it wasn't given to me as the gift that it could be. So I want to offer to you right now to get into a beginner's mindset about what I'm about to say to you and let it sink in as though you've never heard of it, even though you probably have. Okay, here's what I learned in coach certification. This is called the thought model. And it's simply, the way I think about it is like a soap note for your brain. It's a way to just think about your thinking in a framework. And I love it because don't we all love a framework, especially in internal medicine? Okay, it postulates that everything that is happening for you, all of your experiences, fall into one of 5 categories. And only one of those categories is outside of your own brain. Everything else is all made up inside your own brain. The one that's outside of your brain is the circumstance. Okay, circumstances are data from the outside world. It's actually always neutral, right? It is 100% true. It's very factual. You could prove it in a court of law, and it's the stuff that happens outside of you. So it includes things that people said in the past. It includes things that happened in the past. It includes, like, for instance, the circumstance today in Denver, I'm looking at my phone to check it, is that we're going to have a high of 97 degrees. It has been a hot summer. So that is the thought that circumstance is triggering for me. But the circumstance is just the actual degree that is projected, right? So the circumstance for all of us triggers thoughts. As humans, we are meaning-making machines, and we have a bajillion thoughts about like any given circumstance. And so interestingly to me, now that I'm a coach, is that everybody's brain has a slightly different thought. Might even be the same sentence, but it's got a different flavor to it. Right. So my thought about that is actually not that bad. I love summer. I'm a summer person. I enjoy a good water park even, which is not something that is shared by many of the people in my sphere. So my thought is like, okay, great. We can handle 97 degrees. That's even kind of fun. My daughter fried an egg on our driveway yesterday. That was crazy. Maybe we'll do it again. As I look at my phone, I see that my mother-in-law's thoughts about that circumstance are not the same. My mother-in-law, like, love this woman. She is in deep daily fear about global warming. You can argue about whether that's a circumstance or not, but she feels like it's coming a lot faster than most people think it's coming. And so she tracks the weather really, really closely and uses it, no matter what the weather is, as proof that like the world's ending quicker than anybody realizes, like really in the next year or so. And so she's already sent me 3 text messages about like the doomsday that the 97 degrees is predicting. Totally different thought about the exact same circumstance, right? We've got totally different brains, different pasts, different neural makeup. Okay, it is actually our thoughts that cause our feelings. If you hear me say anything in this workshop, it is this. It is our thoughts, not our circumstance, that causes our feelings. This is true. We can show this in fMRIs. This has been published for decades. But most of the time we get hung up because we believe our feelings are being caused by our circumstances. Okay, if that's true, then our circumstances have to change for us to feel better. And so a lot of us go around trying to change our circumstances so that we can feel better. And we forget about this very powerful line here that is our thoughts. I want to pause and say that this is not to mean that you should be feeling good all the time, nor could you. As humans, actually, we are obligated to feel bad about half the time. What I want to give you is the power to choose when. What do you want to feel bad about? Knowing that you can't feel good all the time. What do you want to feel frustrated about? What do you want to feel angry about? What do you want to feel grief about? My guess would be that most of us, you know, if a loved one dies, we don't want to change our thoughts to feel happy about that. We actually want to sort of sink into that grief, okay? But knowing that it's from you, from your thoughts, is a lot different than feeling like you are the victim of your circumstances. It is your feelings that fuel everything you do and don't do. It's how you show up in the world, and that creates your result. When we're talking about imposter syndrome, it is usually that inner critic that is offering us a thought that makes us feel terrible. Okay, so I want you to pull out that initial 2-liner, 3-liner, 4-liner that you wrote when I asked you to consider the last time you felt like you didn't belong somewhere. And I'm going to move through an example of how we might use this thought tool, the thought model, to just parse out those lines of our experience. I'm going to show you an example from Better Together Physician Coaching. This is actually a trainee that wrote into our anonymous online written forum where you can ask for written coaching at any time. So I'm going to give you this example. She then came up for live coaching and has given me permission to use this. This was a resident who wrote in and she said, I was in the MICU and my patient needed an art line. The fellow asked if I wanted to do it, but I had botched the last 3 I tried and I was scared to hurt the patient or look incompetent. I made up an excuse and handed it off to my co-resident. Maybe I'm just not a procedure person and I should consider non-procedural specialties. It sucks since I actually really like the unit and I could picture myself as a cardiologist, but it's not worth it if I can't even place one tiny line. Woof. Sounds familiar, right? This, as a medical educator, before I knew any coaching tools, I was like, oh yeah, fixed mindset. I got to just encourage a growth mindset. Okay, then we'll be golden. Everyone wants a growth mindset, but how do we do it? If we break this down, can anyone here tell me, oh, I just gave it away. I won't make you tell me in the chat. I was going to ask you to tell me what the circumstance is, right? So here is her circumstance. We could argue if the patient really needed an art line, is that actually factual? But for this purpose, let's just say the patient needs an art line and the fellow had asked if she wanted to do it. Now, interestingly, it is easy to believe that her circumstance also includes those last 3 tries. And it does, but not in the way that she gave it to us. So one thing I have learned as a coach is actually to never believe your learner when they tell you thoughts about themselves. Never believe your learner. So this is when I actually asked her to come on for live coaching in front of a group. It's very fun and scary. I'll tell you more about it if you want. She comes on and I asked her about those last 3 times. And here's what she told me. She told me the first one, she was in the unit, she was putting in an art line and she couldn't get it. And she had to ask the fellow to come in. The fellow came in, scrubbed in, and together they placed it. She felt like the fellow did it more so than she. The second time she was asked to do a line, she preemptively asked her fellow to come in and do the same thing. So her fellow came and sort of verbally coached her through it, was scrubbed in, but actually she ended up placing the line for the second one. The third one, she did the same thing, but the fellow just stood in the corner, didn't even put on gloves, stood in the corner and watched her place the line, giving her some verbal tips and feedback. To her, that was botching it, right? I imagine many of us are having different thoughts about that circumstance. I certainly did, but to her, that was botching it. So those are actually thoughts. It's not circumstance. These are all thoughts. Most of what people give you in a thought download are thoughts. Her thoughts are mainly causing this feeling, right? Anybody thinking these thoughts would be scared. I feel fear if I think these thoughts. And her fear is really causing a lot of inaction. Remember, it's your feelings that drive your actions or your inactions. Most people do this if they're deep in fear. Most people hide. Her result, in addition to not learning how to do it, is that she's really limiting herself and now starting to snowball this into like her future career aspirations. Yikes. So here's what it looks like if we were to write it out. And I encourage you to write out your own. See if you can pull out your own thought from that free write I had you do. I'm going to have you write CTFAR, circumstance, thought, feeling, action, result on the left side of your paper, and then fill in your circumstance up here. Her thought in general, I'm going to summarize it as this. I failed before, so I can't do it. That makes her feel scared. Here are her actions. She avoids the procedure, hands it off, call myself names, reconsider career options, and limit myself to only non-procedural things. Yikes, right? It's not a bad, it's a bad result. So again, as a medical educator, before I learned thought-based coaching tools, I might have been tempted to say, oh, I know what you need to do. Let's practice failing, right? Let's get into a growth mindset. In order to change this result, she probably just needs to go to the sim lab. She needs more experience. She needs to double down on art lines and we will get this, right? And I'm going to be the one to help her. But if you don't pay attention to the thoughts that she's automatically having, that progress is going to be so much slower, right? I call that action line coaching or action-based coaching. And if you only coach on the action or the behavior without understanding the thoughts, everyone, you're missing a huge opportunity. Maybe she could willpower her way through art lines. It would be hard and clunky if she's thinking she's a failure the whole time, but like maybe she would go to the sim lab and get through a bunch of art lines until she has proof that she can't do it. But the next procedure she fails at, she's immediately going to go back to that thought. So what I want to offer you is that if you just spend a little time on the thought, the behaviors all come so much easier. Here's what it looks like. If we're going to reframe this thought model, we're putting the same circumstance in, right? Because we're not in the business right now of changing circumstances. That usually happens later. By the way, usually if you change your thoughts, the actions lead to a change in circumstance for many, many things. But we start with not changing the circumstance. And I ask her, listen, the next time a patient needs an art line, how do you want to feel about it? You can start anywhere on the model. You could say, what do you want the result to be? What do you want to do? Or what do you want to think about it? In this case, I asked her, how do you want to feel? And she said, well, capable. If I could feel anything, I'd want to feel capable. But of course, Tyra, I can't like see my thought download, basically. So I said, okay, go into imaginary land and let's pretend that you feel capable. What would you do if you felt capable the next time a patient needed an art line? Knowing that you're still you, the circumstance is still the same. And this is what she said. Well, I'd probably say yes, I guess if I had failed in the past, but I felt capable, I would allow that to be without judging myself. And I would just sort of repeat the task, right? If I felt capable. And any one of us can see, yes, that's that growth mindset we're looking for. That's the learner that we want. That learner is going to learn how to do it. But here's the clincher. Okay, now what thought can you think and believe today that leads to a feeling of capable? And this is so important because this is what differentiates coaching from toxic positivity, right? You can't take this person from I failed before to I'm amazing at this, right? Oh, excuse me, right? She doesn't believe that she's amazing at it. So if we gave her like some positive affirmation, I'm amazing at art lines. I'm amazing at art lines. In fact, what happens is if you say that thought that you don't believe over and over again, your brain has like a temper tantrum and doubles down on the first thought. So you can't just force a thought that you don't believe. That's when the power of coaching comes in. And it might look like a conversation where I ask her, like, gosh, that's so interesting. Can you think of anything else that you have failed at and now can do? Like, why is your brain going there? Can you think of anything that you've even failed at multiple times and now you can do? Is it maybe more true that you're somebody who fails at things a lot and then learns how to do them? And your brain is just having this thought error that shouldn't be happening. Maybe that thought error is because medical training is kind of scary and high stakes, right? But that's interesting too. It's like, do you believe that you shouldn't fail in medical training? Is that a belief that you have? And if that's true, if you think that you should be walking around doing everything perfectly the first time and getting all, great evaluation and honoring everything, wouldn't you be kind of pissed that you even have to do residency at all? Like if you're already as good as the attending, wouldn't you be infuriated actually that you're here making a fraction of the salary, working 10 times as hard? Oh, or is it maybe more true that you totally are expected to fail a lot? And that's the whole reason that residency exists, right? But we just forgot it because that's culturally not talked about very much. Right? So then she can come up with these thoughts that are also true. She's still sort of believing that first one and the brain is going to go there. But if she has another thought that she can practice on purpose that she also believes to be true, then these actions are going to come so much easier. If she tries to force these actions from a place of I failed, so I can't do it, the actions are so hard. But if she is thinking another equally believable thought, the actions come naturally. Okay. Let me know what questions you have about this. I find as an educator, the first most helpful thing I can do is normalize that first thought pattern in myself, showing them that it happens to me still at this stage, because it does. It's like my research meeting. We could do a whole thought model on my thoughts about myself leading that research meeting. I would challenge you to go home and try this. Try this once tonight. Let your brain dump onto a piece of paper about any experience you have, good or bad, for 2 minutes, and then see if you can pick out one thought. I like to circle the circumstances and underline the thoughts. And then I pick one thought and plug it into a model and just see what it's getting me. Sometimes it's shocking. Sometimes it's actually really serving you. And you are like, oh, that's a great thought. I should continue to think that on purpose. A lot of the time it's not serving you and you didn't even know it until you do this sort of soap note for your brain. There is nothing more worthwhile to learn than your own brain. I promise. Okay, these last 2 tools are pretty quick. Don't worry. I'm going to talk about perfectionism. Perfectionism is what drives the inner critic. Okay, my co-director for Better Together Physician Coaching is Dr. Adrienne Mann. We built the program together, and she posted this on Instagram a couple of years ago. And I use it to make a point that we can't always tell if someone's coming from a place of perfectionism or healthy uncertainty or growth-minded curiosity. So she has lots of thoughts about how her fridge should look, how her whole kitchen should look really, but this is what she posted on Instagram. She said, does rigid inflexibility about sparkling water organization represent healthy striving or the dark underbelly of perfectionism rotting at one's core? What do you all think? Who thinks it's healthy striving? Tell me in the chat if you think that it is dark, rotten core, or just raise your little Zoom hands. Who thinks it's a dark, rotten core? You all are either driving or being kind. But her Instagram crew also was fairly kind to her. And the truth is that we can't tell. We can't actually tell if it's perfectionism or healthy striving unless we understand her thoughts underneath the actions. And this is true for our medical trainees and our colleagues and ourselves also. You have to explore the thoughts. The thoughts that drive perfectionism are all around worth, right? We all carry these thoughts like I'm only worthy if I accomplish this, or I'm only valuable if I have a lot of achievements. I'm only worthy if I get this right. Those thoughts tend to be really closed off, right? They cause a lot of closed feelings. So like tight, clenchy, closed feelings. And that drives an action that tries to fix the thought, right? It tries to make you worthy. Versus the thoughts of healthy striving, which tend to come from a place of curiosity. It's all about wonder and awe and fun, and they tend to cause feelings that are expansive or open. So one quick question to ask yourself is simply like, how do I feel right now? Do I feel closed or open? And that might be a clue into perfectionism versus healthy striving. So when you see that medical student staying till like 10 p.m. writing a note, you might be tempted to call that perfectionism and address it as such. But unless you actually ask what's going on, you don't know. Maybe that medical student actually is having these thoughts here on the right. Like, let's see what happens if I try and come up with every single thing on the differential. Wouldn't that be funny if I wrote a note with 40 things on the differential and they're having fun with it? That's totally different than, I need to do this note perfectly so that I get an honors score, so that I can match into ortho, so that I'm not a failure forever in my dad's eyes, or whatever it might be, right? Totally different. You have to ask about the thoughts and the feelings to know what you're coaching on. Perfectionism is really sneaky and really prevalent. All of us have a degree of perfectionism. Some of us even think it's a good thing, right? It's like the thing that you answer when someone says, what's your biggest problem or your biggest flaw in a job interview? And you're like, oh, my perfectionism. I know you're going to love that answer. And I sort of do too. No, y'all, it is holding you back. I promise your perfectionism is holding you back, because here's what it does. It has a belief that if you show up as perfect, you don't have to feel negative emotions. And that belief is wrong. It's just baseline wrong. You can't protect yourself from feeling negative emotions, no matter what. And in fact, when you are stuck in perfectionism, you tragically and ironically end up feeling more because you're so hard on yourself. It's like the biggest tragedy of our training. Perfectionism has this idea where it sets a really high and also really vague bar so that you basically never reach it. This is the idea behind the arrival fallacy, right? I'll feel better when I graduate. I'll feel better when I match. I'll feel like a success once I'm an associate professor, once I've published 10 papers, once I've promoted to professor. It just keeps moving. You never actually feel better, because the same fallacy is still trying to protect you and still trying to set that bar. You just need to show up as perfect, right? This is how it looks for medical training in general. The inner critic is usually offering these thoughts. They don't feel good. They ironically don't cause action that benefits you, but they do cause action that proves that initial thought. It is a vicious cycle. How do we break it? There's a lot of ways. I'm gonna share with you one right now. The quickest, easiest way to break this perfectionistic cycle is to get really clear on what you actually want to define as a success. Okay? So defining success for yourself seems easy, but it's not. If you haven't sat down to define what success looks like, I want you to do it today. Oftentimes I'll ask medical students or residents that are rotating with me, like, what do you want to get out of this month, right? What do you want to get out of your time with me? And they say something like, oh, I just want to be a good doctor. And I'll say, okay, like, how will you know? What does that mean to you? And they look at me like a deer in headlights. They don't know. They're like, oh, well, I'll just know when I get there. I promise you, if you haven't written out what it means to you to be a good doctor, you will never know. You will never get there. So ask yourself, ask your students, no, actually, what specifically does it mean to you to be a good doctor, and write it out. Chances are they're already there most of the way, right? Chances are you're there and you're just not letting yourself feel it. Notice any judgment that comes up here. Challenge beliefs not serving you. Like, are you sure every patient needs to like you in order to be a good doctor? Are you sure you need to get 100% good reviews by your supervisors, peers, or worse, patients? Gosh, what's going on there? Okay, the last tool to rewire our brains, I'm coming back to praise deflection, which I told you is a telltale sign of imposter syndrome. And that's true because people with imposter syndrome, like I said, have this very loud inner critic that they are believing all the time. So if your own brain is telling you a narrative about yourself, even if that narrative is painful, it is more uncomfortable for your brain to be wrong than it is to believe the painful thing. This is the confirmation bias, and we all have it, and we all really want to be right about the world and about ourselves. So if we're walking around thinking negative thoughts about ourselves and somebody else tells us something positive that directly combats this, instead of considering the validity of that, our brains do this interesting thing where they twist around those words in order to make them fit our first narrative, even if that narrative sucks and is hard to listen to. So that's when it's like, oh, they're just being nice. The world is right again. Like you can relax. That's what's going on there. It is so uncomfortable to be wrong about ourselves. Try being wrong about yourselves, right? The work of coaching is to lean into that discomfort of being wrong, because there is the freedom. It is uncomfortable, but you can totally tolerate it. And I promise things are better on the other side. We're going to do it all here briefly together. This is what I'm going to send you out on. I want you right now, you can do it quietly, you can do it in the car, you can do it in bed. I want you to think about your last compliment. Okay? Bring it to mind. Do this right now with me, please. Can be at work. It can be from a patient or a colleague. Could be from a friend, from your mom, from your kid, could be from your dog. Think about your last compliment. And I want you to take a moment to just bask in it. Nobody's watching you. All your cameras are off. I want you to see if you can identify the feeling that your thoughts are bringing up right now. You're thinking about your compliment, you're thinking about it in a certain way, and it's creating a feeling. Can you name that feeling? Is it pride? Is it joy? Is it happiness? Is it just good? What's the feeling? Can you figure out where in your body that feeling is? So maybe close your eyes. I know it's cheesy, but hang with me. If you get comfortable identifying this feeling, this really pleasant feeling, it will come easier to you in the future to do so. So I want you to figure out where this feeling is. And as you're doing that, I want you to attribute it to yourself. Get really clear that you did something to create this result. You behaved in a certain way, you noticed something, you did something that created a good result. And don't forget this, right? So this is different than a gratitude practice. You're attributing this to yourself. This is something you want to do again. And here's something important that I offer to trainees a lot, and I want to offer to you. You are allowed to remember this as many times during the day as you want. And not only are you allowed, but you should. Because it is true that actually physicians who show up to work in a place of pride and self-confidence actually have better outcomes, better patient outcomes than those that show up in doubt and in beating ourselves up. Okay, so this is important work. It is not just because it feels good, although that's a great side effect. It is because you actually show up as a better version of yourself. If you are reminiscing on the times that you did well, our learners too, they show up as better versions if we are praising them, if we are telling them about their strengths, if we are pointing out when they're doing well, than if we are deficit focused, pointing out when they're not doing well, which is what we tend to do. They actually turn into better doctors, and so do you. So this is important work. Also, y'all, it feels great, right? That feeling is warm and fuzzy and open and expansive somewhere in your body. I know it. So I want you to come back here as many times as you can. This is the work of rewiring your brain. Okay. I did it. I told you the last part was going to be fast, but we identified the cause. We went into the effects, which are not good. And then I taught you 3 tools to start using today to reframe, rewire your brain, right? That thought model, managing perfection by defining success specifically. What does it look like? And then letting yourself get there. And then that praise absorption tool. What questions do you have? This is the coaching program website. We are now a national program. We have 3 arms. We have a faculty arm, a GME, so residents and fellows training arm, and a medical student arm. We are closed for enrollment for this academic year because we're starting in September, but we are open for next year if you have any questions or would like to enroll. Ooh, 5 minutes for questions. It was a lot, I realize, and it's a vulnerable talk. And so if you have questions that you want to talk about in private, please feel free to email me. Love talking about all of these things and how it shows up for you. You're welcome. Happy to give you 5 minutes back.
Well, Dr. Fainstad, thank you so much for joining us on this great presentation on the inner critic and how we can recognize it and apply some of your strategies in dealing with it. So thank you once again, and we sure would love to have you join us again sometime in the future.
Yeah,
And good
thanks
luck
so
with your
much.
research.
Thank you. Thank you for having
Thank-
me.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye for now.